In 1879, workers tearing down a wall in an English manor made a discovery that would shake the foundations of British history. A child's skeleton hidden in royal robes, sitting upright as if placed there in a panic. What if I told you England's greatest queen died at age 10 and the person who ruled for 45 years was actually a boy? By the end of this video, you'll see evidence that might make you question everything you know about Elizabeth I. Imagine being responsible for the safety of a king's daughter, knowing that failure means not just losing your job, but losing your head. The summer of 1544 started like any other when young Princess Elizabeth arrived at Bisley Manor in Gloucestershire. She was barely 10 years old with striking red hair and pale skin that marked her as Henry VIII's daughter. London was suffocating under a plague outbreak, and the paranoid king had shipped his children to various country estates for safety. Elizabeth's small household consisted of her governess, Cat Ashley, a handful of servants, and minimal security. The village of Bisley was remote, nestled in the Cotswolds, far from the political intrigue of court. It seemed like the perfect refuge. The manor itself was modest compared to royal palaces, but comfortable enough for a short stay. No one expected this routine precaution to become the setting for one of history's most elaborate conspiracies. The summer air was warm, the countryside peaceful, and young Elizabeth reportedly enjoyed her time exploring the grounds. But as August approached, something went terribly wrong. The princess fell ill with a sudden, violent fever that struck without warning. Medical understanding in Tudor England was primitive at best, and deadly at worst. When Elizabeth's fever spiked, there was little anyone could do except pray and apply useless remedies like bloodletting. The household watched helplessly as the vibrant young princess weakened day by day. Her red hair became matted with sweat, her pale skin turned ashen, and her breathing grew labored. Cat Ashley sent urgent messages requesting physicians, but in that remote location, help was days away. According to the legend, Elizabeth's condition deteriorated so rapidly that within a week, she was gone. The exact cause was never recorded. Possibly scarlet fever, possibly typhoid, possibly one of a dozen deadly illnesses that claimed children's lives with frightening regularity in the 16th century. But the cause didn't matter. What mattered was the impossible situation facing the household. They had the dead body of Henry VIII's daughter, a king infamous for his explosive temper and brutal punishments. This was a man who had executed 2 of his own wives, who had broken from the Catholic Church when it suited him, who had dissolved monasteries and seized their wealth. He had shown zero tolerance for failure, especially when it came to his children. The surviving members of the household knew that returning to London with Elizabeth's corpse was a death sentence for everyone involved. The terror that gripped Bisley Manor in those hours after Elizabeth's death cannot be overstated. Henry VIII wasn't just any king, he was a paranoid tyrant who saw threats everywhere and eliminated them without hesitation. His rage was legendary, his punishments creative and brutal. Anyone associated with the princess's death would face interrogation, torture, and almost certain execution. Cat Ashley knew she would be the first to die, accused of negligence or possibly even murder. The servants would follow, their families disgraced and stripped of everything. The household faced an impossible choice: tell the truth and die, or attempt something so audacious that it bordered on insanity. According to the Bisley legend, they chose survival. They decided to hide Elizabeth's death and find a replacement. But finding a substitute for a princess wasn't like replacing a broken vase. The child would need to match Elizabeth's distinctive appearance: the red hair, the pale complexion, the aristocratic features. More importantly, the replacement would need to be educated enough to maintain the deception, at least initially. In 1544, rural England, educated girls of the right age and appearance simply didn't exist in random villages. But there was another option, one that seemed impossible until desperation made it necessary. There was a local boy who fit the requirements almost perfectly. Who was this mysterious boy who allegedly became England's greatest queen? The legend doesn't give us a name, which is convenient for those who dismiss the theory and frustrating for those investigating it. What we do know from accounts passed down through Bisley locals is that he was the son of a minor gentleman, or possibly a well-off merchant. He had been educated alongside Elizabeth during her stay. It was common for noble children to have companions of similar age for lessons and recreation. This boy had the crucial red hair, the pale skin, and most importantly, the education to potentially pass as the princess, at least temporarily. He knew court etiquette, could read and write, spoke with proper diction, and understood the basics of royal behavior. In the panic following Elizabeth's death, the household saw him as their only chance at survival. The plan was desperate and insane, but what choice did they have? They dressed the boy in Elizabeth's clothes, coached him intensively on her mannerisms and speech patterns, and prepared to present him as the recovering princess. The boy's own family was either complicit or paid off. The legend varies on this detail. What matters is that when officials arrived to check on the princess, they found her pale and weak, but alive. The deception had begun. You might think such a swap would be immediately obvious, that trained courtiers would spot the difference instantly. But consider the circumstances that worked in the conspirators' favor. First, Elizabeth had been at Bisley for weeks with minimal contact from court. People's memories of exact details fade. Second, the recovered princess was kept largely isolated, supposedly still weak from the illness. Third, prepubescent children, especially when dressed identically and suffering from illness, can be remarkably difficult to distinguish. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, no one was looking for a deception. The idea that someone would dare replace a princess was so outrageous that it simply wouldn't occur to anyone. When the household finally returned to London, they presented a quiet, somewhat changed Elizabeth who had survived a terrible fever. Children often emerged from serious illnesses with altered personalities. The trauma and physical toll explained any behavioral differences. Henry VIII, relieved his daughter had survived, apparently noticed nothing amiss. Or did he? Some theorists point to the fact that Henry showed even less interest in Elizabeth after this point, keeping her at a distance and making no moves to promote her position. Was this simply because she was a girl in a world that valued male heirs? Or had the king noticed something off but chosen to ignore it for reasons of his own? The true test of the substitution theory lies in what happened. As Elizabeth aged, and the physical differences between male and female bodies became impossible to hide. This is where the legend transforms from far-fetched Tudor conspiracy to something with disturbing physical evidence. If Elizabeth had been replaced by a boy in 1544, that boy would have hit puberty around 1549 to 1551. This is exactly when historical records show Elizabeth beginning to exhibit unusual physical characteristics. By her late teens and early 20s, Elizabeth started experiencing premature hair loss, an extremely rare condition in women, but notably more common in men, especially those with red hair who are genetically predisposed to male pattern baldness. Contemporary accounts describe her hair as thinning dramatically, to the point where she began wearing wigs constantly. Not just occasionally for fashion, but obsessively, maintaining a collection that would eventually number over 80 elaborate red wigs. Other noble women of the era wore their natural hair proudly, perhaps adding hairpieces for extra volume on special occasions. Elizabeth wore wigs every single day, never allowing anyone to see her without them. Why would a young woman in her 20s need to hide her scalp so desperately? The official explanation is illness or stress, but the timing and severity suggest something more fundamental. But the hair loss was just the beginning of Elizabeth's physical peculiarities. As she matured, she developed an obsession with thick white makeup that went far beyond normal Tudor beauty standards. She used Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, applying it so heavily that foreign ambassadors commented on her mask-like appearance. The standard explanation is that she was covering smallpox scars from a bout of the disease in 1562, but portraits from before her illness show her already using unusually heavy makeup. Moreover, she applied this toxic substance not just to her face, but to her neck, chest, and hands, areas that wouldn't have been scarred by facial smallpox. It was as if she was desperately trying to create a smooth, feminine appearance over features that weren't naturally feminine. She favored high-necked collars that completely covered her throat, even in summer. She wore elaborate ruffs and chokers that made her neck invisible. Contemporary fashion allowed for much more exposed décolletage, but Elizabeth consistently chose outfits that concealed her neck and chest. Was she hiding an Adam's apple? Some portraits, when examined closely, show suspicious shadowing around the throat area beneath the collar, suggesting the artist may have been painting what they saw, but knew better than to emphasize. Elizabeth's body shape also raised eyebrows among those who paid attention. While corsets and elaborate dresses could hide much, they couldn't completely disguise her frame. Foreign ambassadors and courtiers noted her unusually broad shoulders, narrow hips, and lack of the curved waist typical of women. Her hands were large, her fingers long and angular, features more commonly associated with male anatomy. She walked with an unusually long stride that required her ladies-in-waiting to hurry to keep pace. Her physical presence was commanding in a way that went beyond mere royal bearing. Some dismiss these observations as the natural variation in human bodies, and indeed, some women do have more angular frames. But taken together with all the other evidence, the hair loss, the makeup obsession, the concealing clothes, the behavioral quirks, a pattern emerges. One Spanish ambassador wrote cryptically to his king that Elizabeth had a constitution unlike other ladies of the court. A carefully worded phrase that suggested he'd noticed something unusual but didn't dare state it plainly. Another visiting dignitary described her as possessing a frame more suited to martial pursuits, again hinting at something outside the norm for Tudor women. These weren't isolated observations, but recurring themes in diplomatic correspondence throughout her reign. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from Elizabeth's absolute refusal to marry, despite enormous political and social pressure. In Tudor England, marriage wasn't optional for people of Elizabeth's status. It was a duty, especially for a monarch who needed to produce heirs. From the moment she became queen in 1558 at age 25, the marriage question dominated political discussion. Parliament begged her to marry. Foreign kings proposed alliances through marriage. Her own council presented suitable candidates year after year. Elizabeth rejected them all, using increasingly creative excuses. She claimed she was married to England. She said she preferred virginity. She played suitors against each other for political gain, but never seriously pursued any match. This behavior was unprecedented and politically dangerous, yet she maintained it for her entire 45-year reign. The official narrative paints her as a strong, independent woman who chose her own path. But what if the reality was simpler and more sinister? What if she couldn't marry because consummation would reveal the truth? What if she couldn't produce an heir because she was biologically male? The marriage refusal makes perfect sense through this lens. It wasn't political strategy or personal preference, but biological necessity. Elizabeth's romantic relationships tell an even stranger story. She had intense emotional connections with several men, most notably Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. They were so close that rumors of a secret marriage circulated for years. Yet, despite this intimacy, despite countless opportunities for a physical relationship, there's no credible evidence they ever consummated their bond. Dudley remained devoted to Elizabeth for decades, content with a relationship that apparently never crossed into the physical realm. Why? Some historians suggest Elizabeth had been traumatized by seeing what happened to her mother, Anne Boleyn, and feared the loss of power that marriage might bring. But this explanation doesn't account for why she couldn't have a discreet affair, something many monarchs managed without issue. Later in life, Elizabeth developed an intense attachment to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, who was decades younger than her. Again, the relationship was emotionally charged, but apparently never physical. Essex eventually rebelled against her, partly from frustration at his ambiguous position in her life. When physicians examined Elizabeth during various illnesses, she was notably resistant, often refusing thorough examinations even when seriously ill. In 1597, when she was 64 and suffering from severe health problems, she threatened her doctors with imprisonment if they attempted certain examinations. What was she so desperate to hide? The medical examinations that did occur produced cryptic reports that have fueled speculation for centuries. In 1596, a French ambassador reported to his king that Elizabeth possessed physical characteristics not typical of her sex, a deliberately vague phrase that clearly meant something significant, but couldn't be stated openly. Court physicians who attended her were notably silent about her physical condition in their private correspondence, unusual in an era when doctors freely gossiped about their patients. One physician's journal, discovered in the 19th century, contained a heavily redacted entry about examining the Queen in 1599. The redactions were done in period ink, suggesting someone shortly after the examination had deliberately obscured what was written. The visible fragments mention unusual anatomy and contrary to nature, but the crucial details are scratched out. Modern historians dismiss this as referring to some minor abnormality, perhaps a hernia or unusual birthmark. But why would such things require redaction? Why the secrecy? And why did Elizabeth go to such lengths to avoid medical examinations throughout her life? When she fell seriously ill in 1562 with smallpox, she initially refused to allow doctors to examine her fully, only relenting when she thought she was dying and the succession was in peril. Even then, the examinations were apparently conducted with most of her body covered. Elizabeth's insistence on being called the Virgin Queen takes on new meaning through this lens. She didn't just claim virginity, she made it central to her public image and political identity. Virginity became her brand, her defining characteristic, elevated to an almost religious status. Portraits showed her in white, symbolizing purity. Poets compared her to the Virgin Mary. Her propaganda machine worked overtime to present her as married to England, a virgin bride of the nation. This wasn't just clever political messaging, it was essential to explaining why she never married and never produced heirs. By transforming biological necessity into spiritual virtue, Elizabeth turned her greatest vulnerability into her greatest strength. She couldn't marry because she was biologically male? No problem, she wouldn't marry because she was devoted to virginal service to England. She couldn't produce heirs? She would be succeeded by her cousin's son, maintaining dynastic continuity while avoiding the marriage bed that would expose her secret. The Virgin Queen narrative was brilliant political theater, but it may have been rooted in a desperate need to explain the unexplainable. Every time she proclaimed her virginity, every time she rejected another suitor, she was reinforcing the cover story that protected her from exposure. But all of this remained circumstantial until we come to the discovery that reignited the entire theory and gave it physical evidence impossible to ignore. The year was 1879, more than 2.5 centuries after Elizabeth's supposed childhood death in Bisley. The old manor house was undergoing renovations, being partially demolished to make way for a new construction. Workmen were tearing down a wall in one of the older sections when their tools broke through into a hollow space that shouldn't have existed. Behind the wall, they found a small hidden chamber, roughly the size of a closet. Inside that chamber sat a stone coffin, crudely made and clearly hidden in haste. The workers pried open the coffin lid, expecting perhaps old documents or valuables. Instead, they found human remains. The skeleton of a child approximately 10 to 12 years old based on bone development. But this wasn't just any child. The skeleton was dressed in elaborate silk robes, decayed but still identifiable as Tudor-era clothing. Most shocking of all, the fabric bore royal insignia, the unmistakable markings of Tudor royalty. The workmen had stumbled onto something that should have remained hidden forever. The positioning of the skeleton told its own disturbing story. The body hadn't been laid flat in a traditional burial position. Instead, it sat upright, hunched in the small space, as if it had been placed there quickly by people who couldn't risk digging a proper grave. The stone coffin was barely large enough to contain the crouched figure, suggesting it had been built hastily from available materials. This wasn't a planned interment with prayers and ceremony. This was a panicked concealment of a body that couldn't be allowed to be found. The hidden chamber itself showed signs of rapid construction, with mortar slapped on carelessly and bricks fitted irregularly. Whoever had built this hiding place had done so in desperate haste, probably working through the night to finish before anyone noticed. The workmen who made the discovery immediately recognized they'd found something significant. Word spread through the village of Bisley within hours, and within days, the story had reached London newspapers. Medical professionals were brought in to examine the remains. They confirmed the skeleton was female, approximately 10 years old, based on pelvic structure and bone fusion, and had been interred sometime in the 16th century, based on the clothing and burial style. The timing aligned perfectly with Princess Elizabeth's visit to Bisley in 1544. The discovery should have triggered a massive investigation, but instead, something strange happened. The skeleton disappeared. Within weeks of its discovery, the remains vanished from the manor where they'd been temporarily stored, pending official examination. No record exists of what happened to them. Some accounts claim they were taken by government officials for proper burial, but no such burial was ever recorded. Others suggest local authorities removed them to avoid scandal. The most suspicious theory is that someone in power recognized the implications of the discovery and made sure the evidence disappeared before it could be properly analyzed. Remember, this was 1879, decades before DNA testing, but well into an era of scientific archaeology and forensic analysis. If those bones had been preserved, modern testing could definitively determine their age, sex, cause of death, and potentially even familial relationship to known Tudor remains. But we'll never know because someone made sure we couldn't find out. The disappearance of such historically significant remains isn't just suspicious, it's almost unprecedented. Archaeological finds from that era were carefully preserved and studied, especially anything relating to the Tudor period, which fascinated Victorian England. For these particular bones to vanish so completely suggests active suppression. The discovery and disappearance of the skeleton brought old village legends roaring back to life. It turned out that stories about the princess in the wall had circulated in Bisley for centuries, passed down through generations of local families. These weren't new tales invented to explain the skeleton. They predated its discovery by hundreds of years. Village records from the early 1700s mention an elderly resident named Old Maud, who claimed her grandmother had told her about the terrible secret of the manor. According to these accounts, local families had known for generations that something sinister happened during Princess Elizabeth's visit in 1544. The details varied in the telling. Some versions claimed the princess died of fever, others suggested accident or even murder. But all agreed on the core story. Elizabeth died at Bisley and was replaced by a boy to avoid Henry VIII's wrath. The village had kept the secret for generations, partly out of fear and partly because as the years passed and Elizabeth became a great queen, they took perverse pride in their role in history. The boy from their village had become the most powerful person in England. Why expose that now? But the secret gnawed at consciences, particularly in the deeply religious community of rural England. Deathbed confessions were common. The most detailed version of the legend comes from an 1840 account by Reverend Thomas Keble, vicar of Bisley. According to Keble, he had heard the story from elderly parishioners who claimed it had been passed down through their families for generations. The account described how the young princess had been given considerable freedom during her stay at the manor, allowed to explore the countryside with minimal supervision. One day in early August 1544, she ventured too far and fell ill after becoming overheated and then chilled. By the time she was found and brought back to the manor, she was already feverish. Within days, she was dead. The household, terrified of Henry VIII's reaction, searched desperately for a solution. A boy was found, the son of a local landowner, who had been educated alongside Elizabeth and bore a striking resemblance to her. The boy's family was brought into the conspiracy and handsomely rewarded for their cooperation. The real Elizabeth was dressed in her finest clothes and hidden in a hastily constructed chamber within the manor walls. The boy was trained intensively in Elizabeth's mannerisms and speech, then presented as the recovering princess. When the household returned to London, they brought with them a child who looked right, acted appropriately, and fooled everyone, because no one was looking for deception. Keble's account was dismissed as folklore by most historians, just another colorful legend attached to a famous monarch. Then they found the skeleton. The timing of these discoveries and revelations is important. The Bisley legend had existed for centuries as oral tradition, considered entertaining folklore but not serious history. Then in 1879, the skeleton was found, giving physical evidence that a child had indeed been hidden in the manor walls. The skeleton disappeared, preventing verification, but also preventing debunking. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, the theory gained traction among amateur historians and conspiracy theorists. Mainstream academics dismissed it as absurd, pointing out the logical impossibilities of maintaining such a deception. But the physical evidence kept nagging at people's minds. How do you explain the skeleton in royal robes? How do you explain the village legends that predated its discovery? How do you explain Elizabeth's bizarre physical characteristics and behavior? Each piece of evidence alone could be explained away, but taken together, they formed a troubling pattern. Modern historians generally reject the Bisley Boy theory as impossible to prove and unlikely to be true. They argue that too many people would have needed to be involved, that the deception would have been exposed at some point, that Elizabeth's documented intelligence and political acumen couldn't have come from a village boy. But these arguments assume that exposure was likely when in fact, how would it be exposed? Think about the logistics of exposing such a conspiracy. Who would have the authority and evidence to challenge the monarch? If Elizabeth was indeed male, the only people who knew for certain would be those who examined her body intimately. Servants who dressed her, physicians who treated her in private. These people served at her pleasure and would be executed immediately if they revealed such a secret. Moreover, if the conspiracy had existed from childhood, everyone at court would have known Elizabeth as female from the start. They had no baseline for comparison. The boy who replaced the princess would have grown up learning to be female, adopting mannerisms and behaviors expected of women, binding any developing male characteristics, and becoming expert at deception by pure necessity. By the time puberty hit, she would have been practiced at maintaining the facade. The heavy makeup, the wigs, the elaborate clothing, all of it could hide physical changes that might otherwise give away the truth. And who would dare suggest that the Queen of England was secretly male? Such an accusation without absolute proof would mean instant execution for treason. The conspiracy was self-protecting because the consequences of exposure were so severe that no one would risk making the accusation without being absolutely certain. And being absolutely certain would require examining the Queen's body, which was impossible while she lived. Elizabeth's death in 1603 and the handling of her body adds another suspicious layer to the story. When she died at age 69 after a reign of 45 years, her body was prepared for burial quickly, unusually quickly for a monarch of her stature. Normally, royal bodies lay in state for extended periods, viewed by nobles and subjects. Elizabeth's body was sealed in a lead coffin within hours of her death, before most of the court could view it. The official explanation was that she had specified this in her wishes, wanting minimal fuss and quick burial. But this contradicts everything we know about Elizabeth's love of spectacle and ceremony. Why would she want to skip the elaborate funeral rituals afforded to monarchs? The embalmers who prepared her body left no detailed records, unusual for such an important personage. What we do have are cryptic mentions in courtiers' diaries about the body being handled by a very small, carefully selected group. One account mentions the room being kept especially dark during preparation, supposedly at the Queen's prior request. Why? What were they hiding? The lead coffin ensured that the body would be preserved but also sealed from future examination. When Elizabeth was later moved to Westminster Abbey to lie alongside her half-sister Mary, the coffin wasn't opened. It remains sealed to this day. Modern technology could potentially solve the mystery once and for all. DNA analysis of Elizabeth's remains could reveal biological sex definitively, settling the question beyond any doubt. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey contains her lead-sealed coffin, preserved for over 400 years. A simple exhumation and DNA test would take perhaps a few weeks and cost relatively little by modern archaeological standards. So, why hasn't it been done? The official position of Westminster Abbey and the British government is that disturbing royal tombs is inappropriate and disrespectful. They cite historical precedent against opening royal graves, except in extraordinary circumstances. But DNA testing of historical figures has been done before. Richard III's remains were exhumed and tested in 2012, revealing fascinating genetic information and settling historical debates. The difference is that Richard's remains were discovered accidentally and needed identification. Elizabeth's location is known, and identifying her isn't the issue. But is it really just respect for the dead stopping this testing? Or is there a deeper reluctance to risk confirming a conspiracy that would rewrite English history and call into question the legitimacy of every monarch who followed Elizabeth? If she was male, her entire reign was based on a lie. The Protestant succession she ensured might be viewed differently. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of English literature and exploration, all of it achieved under false pretenses. The resistance to testing Elizabeth's remains becomes more suspicious when you consider how much we would gain historically from the analysis, regardless of the result. If DNA testing proved Elizabeth was biologically female, it would definitively debunk the Bisley Boy theory and settle centuries of speculation. Historians would celebrate the vindication of the traditional narrative. The monarchy would be pleased to have conspiracy theories put to rest. Everyone wins, right? So why not test and prove the skeptics wrong? The only reason not to test is if there's genuine concern about what might be found. If there's even a small possibility that the theory is true, that possibility is enough to prevent testing from ever being approved. The British establishment has a long history of protecting the monarchy's image and legitimacy. Revealing that England's greatest queen was secretly male would be devastating to national mythology. It would raise questions about every monarch since, potentially undermining the entire concept of hereditary succession. The tourism industry built around Tudor history would face an existential crisis. Books would need to be rewritten, exhibits redesigned, the national story fundamentally altered. The cost of confirmation, if the theory proved true, would be astronomical in cultural and political terms. Better to let sleeping queens lie and leave the mystery unsolved. So where does this leave us? We have a legend that predates any physical evidence, passed down through generations of Bisley residents. We have the discovery in 1879 of a child's skeleton in royal robes, hidden in a wall, positioned as if concealed in panic. A skeleton that then conveniently disappeared before modern analysis could be performed. We have documented physical anomalies in Elizabeth's appearance that are unusual for women, but common in men. Premature baldness, heavy makeup covering the entire face and neck, concealing clothing, large hands, broad shoulders, narrow hips, masculine stride, and bearing. We have her absolute refusal to marry despite enormous pressure, her virgin queen persona that made a biological necessity into a political virtue, her resistance to medical examinations, and the cryptic reports from those few doctors who did examine her. We have her body sealed in a lead coffin with unusual haste and secrecy, and modern refusal to test those remains despite having the technology to solve the mystery definitively. Each piece of evidence alone can be explained away. Together, they form a pattern that's hard to ignore. The Bisley Boy theory isn't proven. It may never be proven without DNA testing. That will likely never happen. But it's also not disproven, and the evidence supporting it is more substantial than most people realize. The ultimate irony is that if the theory is true, it makes Elizabeth's achievements even more remarkable. Imagine the skill required to maintain such a deception for 69 years through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and old age. Imagine the constant vigilance, the careful management of appearances, the navigation of marriage proposals and succession crises while hiding a fundamental truth about your identity. If Elizabeth was indeed the Bisley Boy, then she, or he, was not just a great monarch, but the greatest actor in history, playing a role every single day without fail for over 6 decades. The intelligence, willpower, and sheer audacity required would be staggering. Perhaps that's why the theory persists despite official dismissals and academic skepticism. We want to believe it's possible because it makes the story so much more fascinating. A village boy becomes England's greatest queen through a conspiracy born of desperation, then rules with such skill that the deception is never exposed. It's the ultimate underdog story, the ultimate triumph of wit over circumstance. Whether you believe the theory or dismiss it as romantic fiction, one thing is certain. Elizabeth I took her secrets to the grave, and that grave remains sealed. Until someone has the courage to open that lead coffin in Westminster Abbey and test the bones inside, we'll never know for sure. The Bisley Boy might be legend, or it might be history's greatest cover-up. The truth is literally 6 feet under, waiting to be discovered. The mystery of the Bisley Boy is one of history's most compelling unsolved cases, and I'll be diving deeper into related Tudor conspiracies and mysteries in upcoming videos. If you want to see more content exploring the hidden truths and shocking theories behind famous historical figures, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single revelation. Drop a comment below telling me which historical conspiracy you think I should investigate next. Your suggestions literally shape the content I create. And if this video made you question what you thought you knew about Elizabeth I, hit that like button to help push this story to more people who deserve to know about the evidence that's been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The more engagement this video gets, the more pressure there might be for actual DNA testing to finally solve this mystery once and for all. Let's make some noise and demand answers.